Hi everybody, Professor Jeff here with another video. I'm going to walk you through Language Power Tutorial 11. Again, this comes from our textbook written by Professor Dana Ferris. So as always, you can follow along on the screen with me, follow along in your own copy of the book, whatever works best for you. So tutorial 11 starts here on page 167. That's where we will begin. And this is uses and abuses of the passive voice. So as you might guess, we're going to spend some time looking at the passive voice, what it is, how to make the grammatical structure, how to construct the passive voice, and of course talk about when and why we use it. So uses and abusive of the passive voice. So you may have been taught to avoid the passive voice in your writing and to use the active voice instead. However, advice never to use the passive voice is unrealistic. So in this tutorial, we'll discuss what the passive voice is, why writers and speakers use it, when to avoid it, and how to edit your own writing so that you use the passive voice appropriately. As always, some questions Professor Ferris asks you to ask yourself. First, what is the passive voice? How is it formed? 2, when is it appropriate or effective to use the passive voice? 3, when is it inappropriate or ineffective to use the passive voice? 4, what strategies will help me choose between the passive voice and the active voice in my own writing? And finally, what tools can I use to evaluate my own writing for effective use of the passive voice? So as always, she starts with a discover activity here on page 168, and here's the activity. It says, discover. Think about what you already know about the passive voice. Analyze each of the following examples and write 1 or 2 sentences in response to the questions about them. 1. In response to a statement given by a campus president about a recent event, a professor commented on a friend's Facebook post, quote, "Why did she use the passive voice? That this happened on our campus. This is not something that happened. It is something that was done." Is the writer of this Facebook comment correct that the quote was in the passive voice? Is the phrase he suggests as an alternative an improvement? What you think? 2. Have you ever seen the following sentence or something like it on a course syllabus? No late papers will be accepted. Imagine that it's the first day of a new semester. Would it change your first impression of the instructor if the syllabus included the following sentence instead? I do not accept late papers. Is the message of those 2 statements the same or different? Why do you think so? 3. Imagine that you are reading a research report in a biology journal. Which of the following 2 options would seem most natural or appropriate to you and why? Number 1. I conducted the experiment over a 6-week period. Number 2, the experiment was conducted over a 6-week period. 4, the following sentence describes an injury during a hockey game. Quote, Morneau was struck in the hand by Bauman's skate blade and his thumb was severed. Severed means cut off. Now, this sentence includes 2 passive constructions, was struck and was severed. Try to rewrite the sentence to get rid of the passives. Compare your rewrite with the original sentence. Which of them seems most appropriate to you and why? 5. Now look back at your responses to items 1 through 4. What observations can you make about using the passive voice? When might it be helpful? When should it be avoided? And as you think about this discover activity, I'm going to especially encourage you to look at number 2 there. The example between no late papers will be accepted and I do not accept late papers. How does that feel different when you look at that or when you read it? All right, so after you've spent a moment or 2 with the discover activity, we'll continue here on page 169 where it says focus, defining the passive voice. Now, you may be a bit unsure of what the passive voice actually is. Item 1 from the discover activity shows us that even well-educated people may incorrectly label a sentence as a passive voice. The clause, that this happened on our campus, is actually in the active voice. The professor who objected to it was probably just uncomfortable with the choice of the verb happened, which suggests a lack of intent or blame. It is fairly easy to define the active voice and the passive voice grammatically. A passive construction is simply a grammatical paraphrase of an active one, as in the following two sentences. The boy kicked the ball was kicked by the boy. These two sentences mean the same thing, but several grammatical movements, have been made in the second sentence to restate the first sentence in the passive voice. Now, the first sentence, the boy kicked the ball, has three major parts. The subject noun phrase, the boy, the verb, kicked, and the direct object, the ball. In the active voice, the subject of the sentence is also the doer or the agent. Agent is sort of a linguistic term. You don't need to worry too much about it, but if it's helpful to you, go for it. This idea of who is doing the action, though, is important, so I want you to get comfortable with it. So the subject of the sentence in an active sentence is the doer or the agent of the action expressed by the verb. The direct object is the receiver of the action. So the boy, agent, doer, kicked, action, what happened, the ball, the receiver, the thing that gets kicked. Now, you can create a passive voice version of this sentence by completing three simple steps. First, switch the positions of the agent and the receiver, the subject and the direct object in the sentence. The ball kicked the boy. Then, change the verb form from the active voice to the passive voice. A passive verb form always has two parts, and I'm going to highlight this because this is how to make the passive voice. A passive verb form always has two parts, a form of the verb auxiliary to be, is, was, were, so on, and the past participle form of the verb. The following is the result of the second step in our transformation process. The ball was kicked the boy. The final step in the active to passive paraphrase process is to clearly signal the agent of the action by inserting the word by. So the ball, still the receiver, but now the subject, was kicked, action, the verb, by the boy. The object grammatically in the sentence, but still the agent, the doer, in terms of the action in the sentence. So, using more complex forms, the agentless passive. And again, I'll just say if this didn't make sense, if what I just said felt like it was too fast, pause this video right here, because you have to understand this basic way to make the passive voice, which is you have an active voice sentence, subject, verb, object. You switch the order, the object becomes the subject becomes the object, the verb. Then we need to make that into passive voice by adding the auxiliary form of the be verb and using the past participle. So kicked becomes was kicked, right? And then you also have to have the preposition here by, right? So if that doesn't make sense, pause this, rewind, look at page 170. Before we talk about when and where to use the passive voice, you have to understand how to make it. So again, but if you're good, let's go. So here on 171, using more complex forms, the agentless passive. And again, remember, agent, Professor Ferris is using agent over here to talk about the doer. And usually, in active voice sentences, the agent is the subject. But this is the passive voice. So this discussion of the passive voice has been pretty straightforward so far. There are, however, more complex uses of the passive voice that can be hard to identify. Some sentences include what is called an agentless passive or agentless passive. Consider this example. Our car was stolen from our driveway last night. This has a receiver, the car, the action of stolen in the passive voice, but we don't have by and we don't have the agent. So we can easily find the action of the sentence. The verb steal in its passive form was stolen. The receiver of the action, what was stolen, is clear too, our car, but who is the agent? Who is carrying out the action? The writer likely does not know. There is an understood agent, a car thief. Writing, a thief stole our car from the driveway last night, doesn't provide more information, however, and omitting, that means taking out, not including, the understood agent, allows the writer to imply that the identity of the thief is unknown. Again, I'm going to highlight that. Allows the writer to imply, suggest, that the identity of the thief, the identity of the agent is unknown. without drawing attention from the main point, that the car was stolen. Writers or speakers often use the passive voice when the agent is either unknown or irrelevant, as in a statement like, "The experiment was conducted." The experiment itself is more important than the identity of the researcher, the person who is doing the experiment. Now, consider the following example. Mistakes were made. Politicians and others in authority or leadership positions often say something like this when something has gone wrong. The reason for using the passive here is to create distance from the mistakes and avoid admitting responsibility. And I'm just going to highlight that as well. So, mistakes were made, right? Mistakes were made. Who made them? Doesn't matter. I'm just talking about the mistakes. We don't need to talk about who made them. Of course, I don't want to talk about who made them because I'm the one who made them. But mistakes were made, right? Very common, very, very common way to see this. And not just politicians, people in positions of power who do not want to tell the truth about their own responsibility for actions, right? Now again, readers will recognize that there's an understood agent responsible for the mistakes, I or we or members of our community or something like that. Though the statement looks like an admission of guilt, omitting, not including the agent, clearly conveys a different message. Quote, I don't want to take the blame for these mistakes. Right, I don't want to take the blame for these mistakes, but I also have to admit, acknowledge, say that they happened, right? So passive voice gives us kind of a middle ground there. Now, an even more complex passive form not only drops the agent, but also the auxiliary verb form be, as in the following example. So, conducted simultaneously in labs on 4 different continents, the experiment yielded results with international significance. Well, who conducted the experiment? I mean, the underlying passive construction is something like this. The experiment was conducted simultaneously in labs on 4 different continents and yielded results with international significance. Either of the 2 preceding sentences could be a paraphrase of the active construction that would reveal who conducted the experiments, the agent. Now, researchers in labs on 4 different continents simultaneously conducted the experiment, which yielded results with international significance. In the passive constructions, the agent, researchers, was dropped. All 3 versions mean the same thing, all are grammatically correct, and all represent legitimate options for a writer, as we'll discuss further. Here, the point is simply that passives can be hidden in other complex constructions, so if you are learning as a writer to control how often and when you use them, it is helpful to be able to identify them. Now, like I said, this one, page 172, this is a much more complicated and complex idea. So I don't need you to pause and understand every single example here. But I do want you to understand that there are obvious examples. The boy kicked the ball. The ball was kicked by the boy. Obvious, easy. That I want to make sure you're comfortable with by the end of this course. Now, what Professor Ferris is showing us here on page 172 is also very valuable because if you're interested in, finishing a bachelor's degree or certainly an advanced, graduate degree, master's degree in the sciences, any kind of sciences, even the social sciences now, but certainly in nursing, medicine, childhood development, any of those fields, the type of construction, type of sentences you see here on 172, conducted simultaneously in labs on 4 different continents, the experiment yielded results with international significance. If you're reading articles for a science class at the bachelor's level or certainly master's level, you will see sentences like this. Very, very common in sort of advanced research writing. So something for you to see, be aware of now. But my expectation isn't that you write sentences like this right now. You can if you want to, that's fine. But I want you to understand the more, more basic form of the passive voice. So that's what I want to say about that. Now, looking at practice number 1 on page 173, Professor Ferris encourages you to analyze each of the following sentences and then complete the chart. The first one is done for you as an example. If the sentence contains an agentless passive, take your best guess about the implied or understood agent. So sentence number 1 says, my car was stolen. And first she asks, is this active or passive? It's passive. Who's the agent? Someone, a thief? We don't really know, but we can assume, right? We understood that it's implied. What was the action? Stole. And what was the receiver? My car. So how about number 2? Essays, including passive sentences, will be given lower grades. Active or passive? Passive. It's passive sentence, right? Here we see will be given. So we have the future marker will, but we also see be as our auxiliary, and give is in the past participle form given. So we could say the action is give, given, right? Now, what was given is the receiver, remember? So what was given is well, I'll pause and let you win. I'll let you do this. You might see this. You might see a graded activity for this in Canvas as well. So I'll let you practice this one on your own. And I want to make sure I just said that the receiver is well, like I said, I was trying to explain this a few different ways, but I think I'm saying it too many times and making it more confusing. But receiver just means the thing that receives the action. And in the passive voice, the thing that receives the action is going to be the subject of the sentence. So pause, review this, and like I said, you might see it again in Canvas. Now on to page 174. This says recognizing uses and abuses of the passive voice. So as you've already seen, absolute rules against ever using passives in writing are overly simplistic. There are times when the passive is not only appropriate, but necessary, right? There are other times when a passive is a legitimate stylistic choice for a writer trying to convey a specific message. Now, the passive voice is sometimes a logical construction. As we've seen, the passive voice often makes the most sense when the agent is either unknown, our car was stolen, or irrelevant, the experiment was completed. Many writers and speakers also use it when the logical agent of the sentence is inanimate. For example, what if the following sentence from the discover activity used the active instead of the passive voice? So, Bowman's skate blade struck Morneau in the hand and severed his thumb. Beginning the sentence with Bowman's skate blade attributes some action to an inanimate object, the skate blade. Although the active sentence is grammatically correct, the writer felt it was odd to say that a skate blade struck someone and severed his thumb because a skate blade can't act on its own. So the writer chose to use a passive construction. Morneau was struck in the hand by Bowman's skate blade and his thumb was severed. Here's a similar example. A cherry pit in a chocolate-covered cherry broke my tooth. Now, as Professor Ferris says, the cherry pit did not decide to break the writer's tooth, so a writer might decide that the passive construction is more appropriate. My tooth was broken by a cherry pit. While there's no specific grammatical rule forbidding the use of active voices in these examples, assigning agency means power, the ability to act, the ability to choose, and assigning agency to inanimate objects may feel unnatural. So passive voice constructions are an acceptable alternative in such cases. Great. Now on 175, the passive voice can allow speakers and writers to distance themselves from their statements. Now, as several of the earlier examples in this tutorial have shown, sometimes writers and speakers choose the passive voice as a way of deliberately distancing themselves from what they're saying. It sounds less threatening, for example, to say, no late papers will be accepted, vaguely implying that it's a departmental or university rule than I do not accept late papers, conveying that I'm a no-nonsense teacher with strict rules, strict policies. Some teachers want to present themselves in a syllabus as being friendly and approachable, whereas others believe that it's best to start out with a strict tone, perhaps softening up over time. In other words, the stylistic choice is a matter not simply of grammatical form, but of the message that the speaker or writer wants to send about who she or he is. And I'm going to highlight this because, again, why do I love this book and what have we been talking about all semester long? Context, context, context. Right? So just because a sentence is grammatically correct doesn't mean that it's sort of the most effective or the best sentence to write in that situation, right? Everything is about context. Who are you talking to? What is the message you want to convey? Who are you? All of these things go into your choices that you make, hopefully, as you're writing. Now, the distancing function of the passive voice is especially notable when a person in power, a politician, a CEO, or a university president, for example, makes statements about a problem. Quote, the decision was made to protect jobs by cutting benefits. These leaders must keep their own reputations, public relations, and even legal liability in mind with every word they write, so they tend to use these types of distancing moves strategically. The audience, however, may well be justified in criticizing such evasions. And this is sort of like I was talking about in the politician example as well, right? Mistakes were made, decisions were made. Okay, well, who made the decision? I don't want to talk about who made the decision. The decisions were made. Now, the passive voice can also help speakers and writers emphasize certain specific information. So a writer may use the passive voice as a rhetorical move to highlight specific information in a sentence. Consider the following variation on the example about the experiment. So, conducted simultaneously in labs on 4 different continents, the experiment yielded results with international significance. The experiment was conducted simultaneously in labs on 4 different continents and yielded results with international significance. Researchers in labs on 4 different continents simultaneously conducted the experiment, which yielded results with international significance. Now, why might a writer choose one of these options over the other? If the goal was to avoid the passive voice and write a straightforward statement about what happened, the writer might choose the active voice. Researchers conducted the experiment. If the focus on the statement is instead the experiment itself, the writer might choose the agentless passive. The experiment was conducted. Finally, if the writer's purpose is to emphasize the unique international character of the research project, the first version would be the best option. Conducted simultaneously in labs on 4 different continents, the experiment yielded. And again, if you are really interested in this stuff, like I am, and you know I'm interested in it too, if you're really interested in the deeper elements of the passive voice, go back and reread page 175 and 176 there. But again, even if you don't fully understand Professor Ferris's point here, that's fine. Again, I'm not expecting you to write these 3 types of sentences like you see here with researchers in labs and conducted simultaneously. That's not my expectation. But again, I do want you to start to see how the passive voice is used in a lot of different ways. The more you see it now, the more prepared you'll be for your next grammar class or the next writing class, or certainly when you go to transfer level English and beyond. Okay, so starting to see these things and notice them is very helpful. Now, the passive voice is sometimes inappropriate or ineffective. So when writers do not want to create distance or avoid responsibility, or when they want to emphasize the doer or agent of an action, then they really should use the active voice. The passive voice may also contribute to wordiness. So if you sometimes struggle with wordiness, examine your texts for the passive voice. Many active voice transformations reduce bulk. The boy kicked the ball, 5 words, is more concise than the ball was kicked by the boy, 7 words. Now, overuse of passives can also be confusing or dull, boring for a reader. Passive constructions can make it difficult to find the agent. They can also suggest that the writer is not confident enough to stand behind the argument. Look at the following sentence. So one idea suggested by researchers is that the continued drug use is encouraged by the absence of withdrawal symptoms experienced as a result of substance dependence. This is a wordy and confusing sentence, and the 3 passives suggested by, is encouraged by, and experienced as a result of contribute to the confusion. A rewrite of the sentence to the active voice improves its clarity a great deal. Addiction researchers suggest that the absence of withdrawal symptoms encourages continued drug use among drug abusers. And again, I'll just read those 2 sentences again because I think there's such a great example here about why the passive voice makes life harder when you're writing, more words, more grammar, and harder when you're reading, less focus on the agent, less clarity around the action of the sentence, right? And you can really see that in these 2 example sentences. So one idea suggested by researchers is that continued drug use is encouraged by the absence of withdrawal symptoms experienced as a result of substance dependence. Again, perfectly grammatically correct. Versus addiction researchers suggest that the absence of withdrawal symptoms encourages continued drug use among substance users. Again, I know which one I like better as the reader. Now, this next example is not as confusing, but it is also not especially stylistically appealing. So, with the first overall pick in what is widely considered to be a weak draft, Houston is likely to draft Mississippi State right-hander Jeremy Wilson, according to Baseball America. This sentence could be rewritten in the active voice as follows. In a draft that experts generally consider weak, Houston is likely to select Mississippi State right-hander Jeremy Wilson with the first overall pick, according to Baseball America. An important reminder, however, is that without context, you cannot always determine whether a specific passive usage is appropriate. The overall text may reveal a stylistic or rhetorical reason why the writer chose to use the passive voice. Also, if the writer does not overuse the passive voice in the text as a whole, an occasional occurrence is not necessarily a problem. All right, we're at practice 2 on page 178. And I'll say it for the last time, we're almost done with this tutorial. If I'm going too fast or the stuff doesn't make sense, pause, stop, rewind. That's what these videos are for. Right? There's a lot of good, dense information in here. Don't let it just wash over you and then get nervous and run away. Pause, go back, rewind. But if you're still with me. Page 178, practice 2. Examine the following pairs of sentences. For each pair, select the sentence you think is more effective. Then, write an explanation for each of your selections. 1a. I did not intend to cause any offense. 1b. No offense was intended. 2a. The strong wind blew the shingles off my roof. 2b. The shingles were blown off my roof by the strong wind. 3a. A burglar stole our television set. 3b, our television set was stolen. 4a, our team of researchers made many serious errors during the experiment. 4b, many serious errors were made during the experiment. 5a, I will accept no excuses for careless work. 5b, no excuses for careless work will be accepted. And 6a, flying debris broke all of our office windows after the explosion. 6b, all of our windows were broken by flying debris after the explosion. It's a really useful activity. So I strongly encourage you, pause, reflect, think about it. What do you see? What do you feel when you read these sentences? Again, basically the same meaning for all six of these examples. Same meaning, and the grammar is good for both. So, which would you use and why? That's what we're really focusing on in this class, right? Now, page 179, using passive voice in your own writing. Now that we've reviewed how passives are formed and the possible uses and abuses of the passive voice, you can examine your own writing using the following steps to see how frequently you use the passive voice, if and when you might overuse it, and if there are ways in which you can use it effectively. So first, examine the genre, the task, and the context, our favorite word. Some academic disciplines, such as the sciences, tend to use passive constructions frequently, whereas others, such as law, strongly discourage it. Even within disciplines, differences exist across genres and tasks. Now, a scientific research report might use the passive voice, but an article on the same research for a popular science publication might avoid it to keep the tone lively enough for a general audience. If you're not sure about the conventions of a particular genre or context, examine some sample texts. Do writers completing similar tasks tend to use or avoid the passive voice? If different authors take varying approaches, do you find one style more appealing than another? Now, regardless of the genre, task, or context, if an instructor requires that you stay away from the passive voice, then make sure your sentences are in the active voice. It's just a good rule in general. And like I said, if you find yourself in a philosophy class or a nursing class or a pre-law class or something in the future, and you're worried about the grades, especially, right? Ask your teacher what's their preference, or what's the expectation within that discipline, within that field of study. Because again, each field of study, each discipline does have its own sort of norms, conventions for writing. Now, analyze your writing for overall passive voice usage. Compare the number of passive voice sentences with the total number of sentences in one of your essays. Your word processing software may even have a tool for automatically generating a percentage of passive sentences in your writing. While there are no absolute rules about an acceptable percentage, especially given differences in genre and context, you might want to aim for a passive sentence count of no more than 20%. Now, these principles are particularly useful if you struggle with wordiness in general. Reducing passive voice usage is one concrete step you can take toward taming your average sentence length. And for more information about wordiness, you can see tutorial 10. In addition to examining a text you're currently working on, you might also want to determine the percentage of passive sentences in papers you've written in the past to see whether your passive voice usage has changed over time. You could also find out if your passive voice usage differs according to the type of text you're writing, such as papers for classes in different disciplines, blog posts, Facebook status updates, or text messages, etc. Next, revise specific passive voice choices as needed. Now, beyond looking at your overall percentages, if you're editing a specific text, much like we will do and have been doing in this class, you might go through each sentence and highlight all of the passive constructions. Then, ask yourself questions about why you might have chosen the passive construction. For example, is the agent an inanimate object or is it an idea? Is the agent unknown or irrelevant? Am I trying to create distance between myself and the statement? And is there a rhetorical reason, such as putting certain information first, why I've chosen the passive in this instance? Now, in answering these questions, you'll probably find passive constructions that you used appropriately and others that you should probably change. Try rewriting the latter, first to change them from passive to active voice, and then, as necessary, to improve clarity or to reduce wordiness. Finally, Professor Ferris encourages you to pay attention to passive voice usage in your future writing. So now that you've become more aware of the passive voice, in general and in your own writing, keep it in mind as you write your papers in the future, making informed choices about when to use the passive voice and when to avoid it. This is a relatively easy thing to monitor for, and doing so will improve your writing style and clarity. And I just couldn't agree with Professor Ferris more. That's why I, use her textbook in my classes. Her whole point is understanding how English grammar works and then making choices, specific, clear choices in your writing and knowing why you make those choices. That is so much more important than can you memorize a list of irregular past participles, right? That's helpful too. You need the past participles, but language use is not grammar quizzes. Language use is speaking and writing. So being self-aware and making empowered choices is my whole philosophy as a teacher. And finally, we have the apply activity on page 181. So Professor Ferris encourages you to select a paper that you're working on now or have recently finished and write brief responses to each of the following questions. 1, analyze the genre and the task. What are the passive voice conventions for the type of text you're writing or have written? 2, will your audience expect passive voice or would they find active verbs clearer? 3, what is the percentage of passive sentences in your writing? Does the percentage seem reasonable, or should you reduce instances of the passive voice? Finally, examine specific passive constructions in the text and consider the analysis questions on page 180. Select at least 2 sentences in need of revision. Write out the original sentence and a revision. Number 2, do a historical analysis of your own passive voice usage. Take papers you've written for school over the past several years and create a small chart showing the date, the genre or task, and the passive voice percentages. As you complete future papers, add to your chart. Do you see any trends or changes? Are they needed? And wrapping up here on page 182, what you've learned. So you've learned to distinguish passive voice from the active voice. That's page 169 to 172. You've learned to form both passive and active constructions. That's page 171 to 176. You've learned to analyze when use of passive voice constructions is effective and appropriate and when it is not. That's 176 to 177. And you've learned to choose actively between passive and active voice in your own writing. That's on page 179 and 180. So if you want to keep building or look at any connected tutorials, you can always review tutorial 1 for parts of speech. You can see tutorial 2 for subjects and verbs, both important when we're talking about the active versus the passive. You can also look at wordiness in tutorial 10, or look at tutorial 19 and 24 for more information about verb tense changes and more information about verb phrases. But again, for now, I'd really like you to focus on understanding everything clearly and comfortably, at least up until page 172. That's the most important thing. So again, if you don't understand the ideas on up to page 172, rewind, go back, rewatch, bring questions to the Zoom meeting, email, text, whatever you need. But that's going to be the most important thing I want us to practice in this class. So thank you for watching this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing all of you again very soon. Bye.